Hey everyone, and welcome. So, I pulled out my portfolio to share some drawings with you guys today since I haven't really shared very much of my artwork, so that you could see that, yes, I do know how to draw, since that's what we're going to be talking about today. So, these little 1 inch squares are similar to what I'm going to be guiding you through in a few minutes. These are more to learn about pencil techniques and, the different types of pencils. So we're going to be working with just pen and talking about line work, but I did just want to share some of my artwork. So I love drawing because it is low maintenance. You don't have to have a lot of money to start drawing, right? You really just need a number 2 pencil and a piece of notebook paper or, printer paper and a pen or whatever. And I think drawing was kind of my gateway medium into visual arts. Doodled a lot in my notebooks in school and so on. I think that's how a lot of young artists get started. And of course, you'll see here there are a lot of techniques that I learned as I went through school, through high school, and then a community college, and then a 4-year college. This one's more of a painting, but I think I just got distracted and was like, oh, I remember this. It was fun. So I did learn how to use a lot of different mediums, different materials, papers, and so on. These ladies were inspired by my years of doing hair. If you can't tell, they're all sort of hair inspired. So a lot of this is from many, many years ago. Some of the artwork I noticed as I dug through this, I had forgotten about. Some of it still had my maiden name on there. So I haven't had that for 15 years. So my point is that, even if you have spent a lot of time drawing and learning all of these different techniques, I've got watercolor pencil, color pencil, pen and ink, so on. You know, Drawing is like anything else. If you stop doing it for a while, if you don't use it, you lose it, right? There's my maiden name on that one. So it's been a long time. And so, that whole adage about riding a bike, I think is silly. The whole idea that, oh, it's like riding a bike. You never forget how. I would beg to argue with that. I haven't been on a bike in over 25 years, and I don't know that that would be the safest thing for me either at this point. But, there is some muscle memory involved in the arts, in drawing and painting and so on. And so even if you spend, 10 or 20 years, like I did, studying your craft and honing your craft and learning techniques, when you step away from it for a while, you lose some of that muscle memory. And so that's what happened with me. I stepped away from it for a while. This was actually the last artwork that I was working on before I left college. Very long story short, I left college because I was just completely burnt out. I was working full time, almost full time, like 30 hours a week, going to school full time. I was exhausted. I ran out of money. And so I ended up going back home and not doing art for several years, not drawing, not painting. So even though my brain still has some of those skills in there, it just took a while for my hands to catch back up again. And so I would encourage you, if you're kind of in that place, to practice some of the exercises that I'm going to share with you today, because that is what I did, honestly. I came back to some of the things that I learned in school that I said, ugh, to how boring when I was in school. And so now that is actually what helped me get my muscle memory back again and helped me get control over my hands again, to get my hands to kind of match up with what my brain wanted to do, right? So today I'm using Bristol paper. This is a really smooth Bristol paper. I'm going to talk about that in a minute, or as we go, really. And I am using Micron pens. Pardon me while I fast forward through this and be very Virgo, because I have to organize my Micron pens every time I use them by size and so on. I have a little system so that I know where they are. So basically, we're just going to take a piece of paper, use whatever paper you have. Don't stress out about it too much right now, especially at the beginning. And we're going to make 1 inch squares. Now, I absolutely love this little clear ruler because, as you can see, it's 1 inch on both sides, which makes it really easy for these little squares. I've had this little guy forever. I can't even remember where I got it. I will look and see if possibly I can find a link maybe through Amazon if you guys are interested in purchasing it, because it makes making these squares and even measuring other things very, very easy. And my little guy here has been through a lot, like a lot, and he's a little worse for wear, but I'm probably still going to keep him forever. Anyway, so just 1 inch squares. The great thing about this is there's the 1 inch on the top, and you don't have the centimeters on the other side. So you can see I am just going top to bottom. Here's a fun trick. Most rulers, in my experience, are 1 inch wide. So if you are ever making a whole lot of squares doing something like this, just keep that in mind. So it makes it a little easier to get the boxes on there. Basically, we're just going to make a whole bunch of 1 inch boxes to play around with doing different line work in. And this is just a great way to create some practice squares, a little practice page for things. You can even smush all the boxes closer to each other if you want, or right next to each other if you want. So again, the funny thing about this is I remember the first time I had to do this at the community college I went to. I had to do it a couple of times, and I was like, oh, this is so lame. This is so boring. Why do I have to do this? So I had a wonderful teacher who just took all of our whining and complaining from all of the students kind of in stride and just encouraged us. So shout out to Mr. Davies. Yeah, so now he can be like, I told you so. This was worth doing, right? As teachers probably do often. But I honestly, once I got back into drawing, once I had the time and capacity, I sat down and I wanted to draw wonderful, amazing things, and my hands just felt weird. So if you know what that's like, you know what that's like, right? So this is just a great way. It's kind of like warm-up exercises and just getting reconnected to everything again. So don't be afraid to do things like this for that. This is also a great practice if you're a beginning artist and you are still kind of getting your sea legs with art. You're still trying to get your hands to catch up with your brain and do what you want them to do. It is all about building control and muscle memory, and in the least stressful way possible. So one thing you'll notice is I went from starting my lines on the left side to starting them on the right side. Part of that is the Bristol paper is really smooth. The Micron pens dry pretty quickly, but they might still smudge, and you'll see that one smudge on that second box on the left. So just be aware of that as you're moving across the paper, depending on the paper and pens you're using. So the first thing that we're going to do, we're just going to practice lines going in different directions. So here I'm starting top to bottom, and I'm going to do my vertical lines, right? So I'm using a number 5 micron for this because it's kind of my go-to micron pen. And you'll see I'm trying to kind of keep the lines the same width apart. You'll also notice some wobble. This is not something that you have to do quickly. This is all about learning control. And when I say control, I don't mean stressing out control. I mean, what is the most comfortable way for you to hold your pen? What works best for you? Not necessarily what works best for someone else, but you'll notice how I kind of change my hand position a couple of times just to see which way feels like I have the most control when I'm doing these horizontal lines. So the reason I'm switching to my left hand, you'll notice very quickly I am definitely not left-handed. But if you are a lefty, please don't feel like you have to go from left to right the way that I am in the video, because you're going to be able to see what you're doing more easily if you are working from the right to the left. This is your art. This is your practice. Do what works for you. And also, if you're working in the opposite direction, you won't smudge as easily. So I'm going to just write vertical at the top of this just for future reference to know, which way I did these. I did these from the top to the bottom. So in the next square, I'm going to practice going from the bottom to the top of the square. So the reason I'm switching it up is again, just to see which way feels like I have more control over what my hands are doing. That doesn't necessarily mean that you say, oh, this is the way that works. That's it. I'm done. And I'm never practicing the other way. But it is good for reference. So you can see how it kind of wants to curve a little bit at the top. Um, as I'm going from top to bottom, I kind of want to skew out a little bit. It's a little bit subtle, especially from a distance, but you can see how it's a little bit more wobbly. You also see how I sort of turned the paper a bit. That's something that I just sort of do automatically now. And I'm not sure if I even realized I did it, but don't be afraid to turn your paper and play with that as well. This is not a challenge about how perfect can you be for everything? So then I made a little note of when I turned the paper and I see that on those lines, they are more evenly spaced and have a little bit more control in them, right? So just making these kind of notes when you're doing exercises like this can be very helpful for you to reference later. It gives you a nice reminder of which way works best for you and which ways are a little more challenging for you. So here we're going diagonally from the left toward the right. Again, play around with your hand positions when it starts to get into those longer lines. Notice if you need to slow down a bit or if you need to change your hand position. This is not about perfection. I am probably going to say that way too many times, but I'm going to say it until it's drilled into all of our minds, even this Virgo talking right now, that it is not about perfection. This is about practice and seeing what works best and just kind of learning that for yourself. So again, draw the little reference arrow. And then of course, now we're going to do diagonal again, but we're going to start from the right and go to the left. So as you go about these squares as well, you will just kind of notice what feels more comfortable. This is not a sheet for you to memorize. And when you go to do your artwork, reference your sheet and say, okay, I'm doing this or I'm doing that. I need to turn my paper a certain way, hold my pen a certain way, and do these particular lines for this particular part. This is all about, again, just kind of building that muscle memory and all of these things like turning the paper, deciding on the line, that all becomes very intuitive. So don't feel like you have to memorize this. This is stuff where you're just going through the motions and you are going, your brain is just going to automatically do that. So you see where these got really wide in the middle? That's where I started turning the paper and experimenting. So just that's why I kind of pointed that out. So just something else to note. So now we're going to go horizontally and start from left to right. Is that what I'm doing? I can't remember. Yes, starting from left to right. Okay. And see how that works. And you'll notice that as you do this the first time or even the next few times, that some are easier than others. So the horizontal for me seemed to go pretty much better than some of the other ones. I'm going to make a little excuse for myself here. Excuses, I know. Usually I'm hunched over my paper like a little art goblin. So having the camera there and not being able to put like my nose half to the paper, almost like down touching my work surface, is kind of throwing me off a little too. I don't know if you guys can relate to that. But, again, like it depends on what I'm doing. Sometimes I do better if I have distance from the paper. For things like this, for these detail and control kind of things, I think for some reason I just have to be hunched over like some kind of little gremlin for it to be, nicer. But anyway, again, we're not doing perfection, right? So another thing to think about as you are doing these squares is as you are going, start playing around with how close together you get your lines, how far apart you get your lines. Just kind of experiment with it, right? And just challenge yourself, try to get some spaced further apart more evenly, try to get some of them closer together, see how close together you can get them. This is also as much a matter of getting familiar with your paper and your pens, your materials, as it is being able to draw the lines. Because again, this Bristol paper is very smooth. I usually use illustration board, and that has a little more tooth to it. And I do use my Micron pens, like they're my favorite things to draw with when I'm doing line work. But having a paper that has a little more tooth and a little more grip also allows for a little bit of a smoother line with these pens. It's what I'm used to. And I'll talk about that again in the next row. So what I'm doing here is just going through and marking the ones that look to me at first glance, without overthinking too much, which ones look the neatest at the moment. It's not about, oh, which ones are exactly wonderful, beautiful, perfect, but which ones look the neatest so that I can just kind of remind myself of that later. So now I'm using my number 8 micron, which is a larger pen. So if you are struggling with a finer line, a fine tipped pen, think about going to a larger size. Now you'll see initially that it's a little bit of a wobble because these pens they're like not a, I don't know if you'd call them a ballpoint. I should know that. But they're not like a felt tip or anything, but they're very round and very smooth. So it kind of took me a minute on this smoother paper to get the feel of that, because it's almost like the pen just sort of rolls on the paper, not really rolls on the paper, but glides on the paper very smoothly. So again, this is a 10. And so you can see how it offers just a little more control because it's a little bit of a wider ink surface and it has a little bit more grip than the smaller point pens. So if you are really struggling, think about just using a thicker pen. Use a 10 or even a 12 until you start feeling more confident, and then move down to like the 8 or the 5 or the 3. And if you are really struggling and it's driving you nuts, again, don't use a very smooth paper, just use a paper with a little more grip, okay? I mean, Bristol comes in grippier papers as well. This just happened to be what I pulled out of the cabinet. So play around with it. This is a number 3. So you can see how it's a little bit thinner, a little bit more wobbly, and play with the different pen widths, play with pencil, see what you're most comfortable with. This is all about regaining some control or learning some control, muscle memory, and just practice and play and see how it feels. And again, don't rush out and necessarily feel like you have to buy Bristol paper and Micron pens. If you have printer paper and a pencil or pen at home, just use that. Use whatever you have and just get started. That's the main thing. Just get started and let it be fun. Don't put pressure on yourself. So since we're talking about line, we're going to talk about hatching. And hatching is basically just separated lines. You'll see this a lot in comics and even in some artworks just for shading purposes. It's basically disconnected lines, but it's also worthwhile to practice. And you'll notice that as you practice getting control of your lines, doing something like hatching becomes a little easier because you do want them to be parallel to each other for the most part. At this point, I think I realized that my faithful number 5 micron is running out of ink. And I think I even tried to use her again a couple of times because I just don't want to let go. But I had to switch to a different micron here. So she's a little wobbly. So sometimes that's an issue too. So again, the hatching, try it from different directions. You'll notice that when I go from left to right, I have a little bit more control, just like when I'm doing my, controlled horizontal lines. And when I go from right to left, it got a little wobbly. You can play with the speed on the hatching. Make it a little more wispy, things like that. So when we have hatching, then we also have cross hatching, which is just what it sounds like. And you create your hatches, your lines. I think this is where I tried my number 5 again. I'm so stubborn. I have to say goodbye. And then once you have your lines, you're going to cross over them with another line. So again, this is a good place to know which way you're more comfortable, if it's from up to down or down to up or left to right or right to left, right? So just play around with this. Create as many boxes as you want, create lots of different things, have fun with it. If the 1-inch boxes are stressing you out and you are getting frustrated, you can make smaller boxes. You can even just draw a line in between your 1-inch box and start with shorter lines. Practice with shorter sections. All right. The key is to build your confidence, not to frustrate you more. So when you start with these shorter lines, you can see even mine here. If it would stop being blurry, please. Thank you. You can see where there's a bit more control and it's just less distance to cover. So again, you're building muscle here. So once you have got the hang of filling in these smaller spaces, then move on to filling in the larger spaces. And it doesn't have to be all the same. You'll notice I'm starting to switch it up because I'm like, okay, that's been enough of this. Don't let it get boring. If it gets boring, switch it up. Start creating some patterns if you like. And then once you get the hang of the smaller spaces and you maybe move into the 1-inch squares, you can always experiment and start creating 1.5-inch or 2-inch squares and build that muscle and that coordination up a little bit. This is a little bottle cap that I use for glazing things. I just pour my glaze in there. So if you're tired of the squares, just make a circle. You can trace some circles, keep life interesting, fill in some interesting shapes. That's what I'm about to do here. We don't want this to get boring. We don't want this to feel like you are in the world's most boring, fill in the blank, whatever subject you don't like, class, right? And you would rather have a root canal than to do this. So once you kind of get control of this, start creating shapes. Create some weird shapes and practice your lines. You can do curved lines. It's all about, trying to keep the spaces equidistant and all of those kind of things, make it fun. You'll also notice here that I start just kind of turning the paper. This is where I sort of zone out and I get into my creative zone. So I just am turning the paper whichever way I want to, which gives me control. And this is what I was talking about, you guys. This is where, you're not going to go back and have to reference your pages, maybe at first so that you know where your strengths and where your not so strengths are. I don't like the word weaknesses because it's such a negative sounding thing, but we're all going to be stronger in some ways than others. So that's great to know, but eventually as you are just doing this, it just becomes intuitive. Like your brain is just going to know what works, what doesn't work, and you can get into the flow and it's not going to feel so complicated or arduous or anything like that. So just kind of have fun with it as much as you can. And you never have to show these to anybody. I mean, this is not, this can be your little secret that you're practicing all these lines so faithfully. But this really was what led me into a lot of my line drawings as well. And I'm going to share some of those with you in a minute. So I actually found that doing this not only helped me regain some control over my, kind of helped me get connected again with my art hands, but it also became very meditative for me to be able to do this. So here are some boxes. You see my little notes, practicing doodles, so rusty. So this is what I started. I had this sketchbook that I actually forgot all about. So there's only a couple of pages of stuff in here, but this is where I'm doing the boxes. You can see where I practice the hatching in different ways. And then I kind of just got into doing these circles, which I forgot I had done, and I actually really love them. They're super colorful and bright. So just, do the line work, play with coloring it in, let your creativity flow, take it wherever it leads you. And I think I'm gonna have to do something with these because they're really cute. So here's my other sketchbook where I really started embracing just doing the line work. So again, this is how I'm retraining myself to draw and getting control. You can see at this point, I had done some practicing and playing, and it's starting to loosen up a little bit, right? And I'm just playing with the swirly lines, like kind of just making it interesting, making it fun. So it doesn't have to be just doing the squares. It can be really just creating lots of interesting shapes and seeing how you can work those lines in there. This doesn't have to be a boring exercise. It can actually become very artsy and very, very creative. So these, I call these my wandering line drawings. People call them Zentangles sometimes, but that's like a copyrighted situation. But you'll see as I do these, I just let the pen wander. I play around with shorter lines, with adding dashes and dots into some of them, with letting them swirl. And this for me has become a very meditative thing. You'll see here close up, it's still not perfect in some of the places. And if it becomes imperfect, I just make it work. So I hope that you guys enjoyed this. Let me know if you're going to make some little 1-inch squares, what you think about how it's helping you either learn, some control with the line work, or if it's helping you to regain some muscle memory from drawing in the past. These are just some of my drawings that I have in my Etsy shop. You can see where it definitely did start getting a little bit more neat and tidy. If you guys loved this and if this was helpful, follow me on Instagram, like and subscribe. I'm going to be doing more and more art tutorials coming up. I'm excited about that and sharing artsy, fartsy kind of things. Thank you for watching. Let me know what art you're doing, and I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day. Go be creative and make lots of cool stuff. Bye-bye.